Welcome back to Books and Backbone. My name's Donna Harris. I'm the CEO and owner of Bookkeeping Made Simple, your host. And today I want to talk about something that comes up in almost every small business acquisition conversation, and that most sellers encounter for the first time at a negotiating table without fully understanding what they're agreeing to. And that's the earnout. If you've ever sold a business or seriously considered selling one, you've probably heard this word. Maybe a broker mentioned it, maybe it appeared in a letter of intent and you had to ask what it meant. An earnout is a deal structure where part of the purchase price is paid after closing based on whether the business continues to perform at a certain level after the sale. That's what it is. In theory, it's an alignment mechanism. The seller gets paid more if they hand off the business well and the revenue holds. The buyer pays for what they actually get rather than what they were promised. In practice, earnouts are a bit more complicated and more consequential than most sellers realize when they first encounter them. And I want to explain how they work, when they protect the buyer at the seller's expense, when you can generally work in the seller's favor, and what to watch for before you agree to one. I'll also let you know how I structure earnouts in the acquisitions I'm doing, because I think transparency on that point is useful for anyone who might be selling to someone like me. Well, let's start with the mechanism. In a typical small business acquisition, the purchase price is calculated based on a multiple of seller's discretionary earnings, which we've talked about in other videos, usually 2 to 4 times for a small business. We covered that in detail earlier this week and last week and the week before. The total purchase price might be $750,000, but the buyer isn't always willing to pay $750,000 at closing. They're paying for a business that performed a certain level under the seller's ownership, and they're uncertain how much of that performance will survive the transition to a new ownership. So the deal gets structured in layers. A portion of the purchase price, let's say $550,000, gets paid at closing. That's typically funded through SBA financing, cash, or a combination. The remaining $200,000 is an earnout. It's contingent on the business continuing to perform at a defined level for a defined period after closing, and that's usually 12 to 24 months. If the business hits its performance targets, the seller receives the earnout payment. If it does not, if revenue drops, if clients leave, if the performance metrics are not met, the seller receives less than the full amount or none of it. That's the structure. And as you can see, the risk in an earnout is almost entirely on the seller. So let me be direct about what earnouts are primarily designed to do. They're designed to protect the buyer. They transfer the risk of revenue attrition, that is, the risk that clients leave after the owner departs, that the business underperforms post-closing, that the seller's representation of the business value doesn't hold up in practice, from the buyer to the seller. They're transferring the risk from the buyer to the seller. The seller who accepts the earnout is saying, I believe my business will continue to perform after I leave. I'm going to say that again because I stumbled over my words and you want to be able to hear this. I believe my business will continue to perform after I leave, and I'm willing to have my part of my purchase price contingent on that belief being correct. That's a significant bet. And it's a bet the seller often fully doesn't appreciate until they're in the earnout period. Now, here's what can go wrong. The buyer changes things. They shift the service model, the pricing, client communication approach. Clients respond poorly, revenue drops, the earnout metrics aren't met, either through decisions that the seller had no control over. I see this a lot in restaurants. And you probably do too. Venture capital comes in, they purchase a restaurant. The seller of the restaurant had everything. It was their life's work. Everything was the way they wanted it. The food was high quality. It was absolutely delicious. Service was good. And then venture capital money comes in. They buy out the restaurant and they start to change things. and then customers leave because the food isn't as good as it was. One example would be Papa John's Pizza. I worked for Papa John's when John himself was first starting it. They were first getting franchisees. I was a manager at a Papa John's Pizza, and then over time, I noticed that the really amazing pizza we made, and it really was really good pizza, was not as good. And this was after I had left my position there and I'd gone into accounting, and I went back for pizza several years later, actually, because I mean, let's be honest, it's not the most cheapest pizza on the planet. And I was in a position where I needed to eat cheap. So I went back and I got Papa John's pizza again. It just wasn't as good. And I couldn't put my finger on it. But the fact is, the original Papa John said better ingredients, better pizza. The current Papa John is saying cheaper ingredients, more profit. So they are losing customers. Um, Maybe not as much as they used to because people have gotten used to the new taste, but sorry if I'm stepping on anybody's toes. This happens to be a company that I am personally familiar with. So in that case, the transition was supported. We didn't leave. Nobody that was working for Papa John's left because John was no longer involved. Um, but the quality of the product dropped, and as a result, their sales also dropped. That's one of the ways that the buyer can mess up the business. Okay, they're going to change things. They're going to change the pricing. They're going to change the ingredients. They're going to change whatever it is that you're selling to increase their profits without maybe understanding why their customers are leaving. Okay, now the metrics are defined in a way that's very difficult to hit even if the business performs well. Earnest agreements can be written on targets that sound reasonable but are practically difficult to achieve given post-closing business conditions. I want to be very clear that not every earnout goes badly. Some of them go very well. But sellers need to understand that the earnout structure places them at the mercy of a buyer's post-closing decisions. And that's a meaningful risk. So here's the other side, because earnouts aren't always better for sellers. They're not always bad for sellers. And I think it's important to be honest about that. An earnout can work in a seller's favor under a few specific scenarios. When the business is genuinely strong with recurring revenue and the seller is confident the client base will stay. If 85% of your revenue is under annual contracts and you have long-term relationships with your clients, the earnout risk is narrow, but it's real, but it's manageable. The clients are very likely to stay regardless of who owns the business. When the seller is staying involved during the transition period, many earnout structures include the seller in a consulting. I promise I can speak English. When the seller remains on in a consultative capacity, so they are consulting with the buyer. They are telling the buyer, this is what we tried and this is what works. Then that does give them some ability to influence the outcome. If you're going to be present during the earnout period and you believe in the business performance, the earnout is a lot less risky than it appears. So if you're going to have an earnout, I keep thinking I'm saying burnout, like someone who's just burnt out. If you're going to have an earnout period, then the seller needs to stay involved. When an earnout is structured around metrics the seller can influence, so like retention, whether specific named clients stay or whether a percentage of clients stay, that is a more seller-friendly structure than one tied to total revenue, which can be affected by factors entirely out of the seller's control. When the earnout is priced into the total deal fairly, when the total deal value, closing payment plus earnout, represents a fair multiple of seller's discretionary earnings, or SDE, and the earnout targets are achievable based on historical performance, accepting the earnout might be the right decision to close a deal that otherwise wouldn't get done. I also want to be transparent about how I structure the deals I'm doing, because I think sellers have a right to know what a buyer who is approaching this honestly looks like. At Bookkeeping Made Simple, I do an earnout in every acquisition I do, not because I'm trying to shift all the risk to the seller, but because I genuinely believe an earnout creates the right incentive for a clean transition. Here's how I think about it. The earnout's not a discount, it's an alignment mechanism. The seller has every incentive to introduce me well to their clients to support the transition and to make sure the business lands well in new hands because part of their payment depends on it. The sellers who do the transition right, who are present, make warm introductions, who help clients feel confident in new ownership, are almost always earn the full earnout. In my experience, that's a typical outcome when the seller is genuinely invested in the transition. In accounting, these are people we know, our clients, we know what they do, we know who to talk to. It would be like when I called my brother and I happened to be at the hospital with my husband. It was not any sort of uh, emergency, but my husband was having a procedure and it went longer than I expected. So I call my bookkeeping manager and say, hey, can you reschedule this appointment that's coming up in an hour? He says, yeah, what kind of person should I expect on the phone? Well, it's so and so. He's super friendly. He's super nice. He's going to be super easy to work with. Just call him and reschedule. Just do it right online. He's going to be a gem. You're going to love him. It's a little bit different than me calling and saying, hey, Dave, can you reschedule with this person? She's a pain in the neck. You're going to have to be, tippy-toe around her. Or leaving him with worse, finding out that she's a pain in the neck and you have to tippy-toe around her and I didn't tell him. Okay, so there's a lot of things that the seller can do to help the buyer and to make sure that they're getting their full earnout. Okay, the sellers who do the transition right are going to earn their full earnout. The earnout also protects me as the buyer from overpaying for revenue that leaves immediately after closing, which is a real risk in a service business, which accounting is, where relationships matter. My current earnout structure typically covers about 12 months post-closing, is client retention rather than total revenue, and represents 15 to 20% of the purchase price. I tell every seller I work with the same thing. If you do the transition well, you earn the full earnout. The earnout's not designed to be a hurdle, it's designed to be an alignment. So I'm going to come into a new business with my processes and procedures and my manuals, my staff, and I'm going to ask the seller, help me integrate all of this. Help me, introduce me to your team, introduce me to your clients. We're going to change this, this, and this, but not that, that, and that. Okay. Whether you accept the framing depends on how much you trust the buyer, which is exactly why buyer selection matters as much as the deal structure. If you're evaluating a deal with an earnout, here are specific things to scrutinize before you begin or before you sign. One, how are the earnout metrics defined? Revenue, gross revenue, net revenue, client retention, specific named clients. These are all different measures with different risk profiles. So, for example, I'm going to go into fiction for this one. Mad Men. Been watching Mad Men a lot. I still haven't made it through to the end of the series, but I've been trying. It happens that my husband thinks it's boring. I do not. But they sold out the business a couple of times, and one of the things the buyers were going to look at are, well, you have Lucky Strike tobacco. Are you going to be able to keep them? And there's several episodes where they talk about the possibility of losing Lucky Strike as their biggest account. So you can kind of go into some of these business shows and watch this. The earnouts depend on how the seller treats the buyer in the earnout period. Okay. So client retention by named client is the most seller-friendly metric. Total revenue is the riskiest. Notice that I don't choose the riskiest metric for the seller. I'm looking at client retention, but I don't want to set a hurdle that's so big that the seller can't overcome it. I want to make sure the seller is aligned with me. Okay. So what is the earnout period? How long are you going to be on the hook working with the buyer of your business? 12 months is standard, 24 months is longer risk exposure. I would not recommend anything past 24 months. What control do you retain during the earnout period? If you have no involvement and no visibility into post-closing decisions, you are entirely at the buyer's mercy. consulting agreement that keeps you involved during the earnout period is meaningful protection. What does that mean? Well, that means that the buyer can call you and say, they're going to pay you. They're going to pay you for the consultation. This is completely separate from the sale of the business, okay? So I can call the buyer and say, hey, I have Mary Jones on the phone, and she says she's worked with you a lot. Can you give me a heads up on what is going on with her account so I don't have to go back through it all, okay? Or maybe I call and say, hey, I'm having a problem with this employee that you hired. What exactly did you agree to? But again, that's where the documentation really comes into play. As a consultant, you have a lot of control over what happens in the post-closing period, during the earnout period. So what happens to the earnout if the buyer sells the business during the earnout period? Okay, the buyer bought your business and they're turning around and basically they're flipping it. This should be explicitly addressed in the agreement. Some earnout agreements survive a subsequent sale. Others don't, which means your earnout can disappear if the buyer flips the business before your earnout period ends. Is the earnout payment secured, or is it an unsecured promise to pay? The seller who has an unsecured earnout claim against a buyer who runs into financial difficulty may find that claim very difficult. Make sure it's secured. Get an attorney involved before you sign any earnout agreement, not a general business attorney, one who has specific M&A transaction experience. For those of you who don't know or are wondering what that means and are thinking I'm going to have to go look up what M&A is, it just means mergers and acquisitions. So you want an attorney with experience in mergers and acquisitions. The earnout is where the deal complexity lives, and you need someone who reads these agreements regularly. An earnout's not inherently bad for a seller. It depends on how it's structured, what the metrics are, what the buyer's intentions are, and how confident you are that the business will perform after you leave. If you know what I know from being on the buyer's side, is that the sellers who approach the earnout as a partnership, who are invested in the transition, who make warm introductions, who stay engaged during the handoff, almost always earn it in full. And the sellers who approach it with suspicion and minimal involvement often don't. The earnout tells you something about what kind of buyer you're dealing with and what kind of transition they expect. Pay attention to both. If you own a bookkeeping or accounting firm and you're thinking about what an exit might look like, or if you want to understand what a buyer like me is actually looking for, I'd love to have that conversation. You can find me at mysimplebookkeeping.com. You can schedule an appointment at mysimplebookkeeping.com/contact. And you can reach me directly at donna@mysimplebookkeeping.com. All of my contact information is in the description below. I'm Donna Harris. This is Books and Backbone. Know what you're agreeing to before you agree to it.